Hi, I'm Mars, and I will be talking about being non-binary in Iceland.
Hello, my name is Oliver, and I'm a trans guy who makes videos about LGBTQIA+ people, where they get to talk about anything that they want that somehow relates to them being queer. In July, I spent a week in Iceland, and apart from visiting hundreds of waterfalls, I also sat down with some local queers to hear about their experiences. First out is Mars.
My name is Mars. I go by they, them pronouns. I'm a bath enthusiast. I take a lot of baths. I do some theology and some physics and some science in the academics. I have done some activism through my life, mostly trans-related, but also like the general queer kind. I identify as non-binary in the gender sense, and in the sexuality I don't label it as much, probably just queer. But I've been like dabbling with maybe gay. But then again, people perceive that in different ways because they read my gender in different ways, which I quite like. But when people ask, I usually say I'm straight because it's a bit funny, because that doesn't mean anything when you're non-binary. But usually people that ask also don't get the joke.
So, Mars is non-binary, and that's what they're going to focus on in this video.
When I first came out, which is probably like 5, maybe 6 years back, I started realizing my gender identity around 18, 19. At that point, I didn't know any trans people. Like, no binary trans people and definitely no non-binary people. And the terms weren't very integrated into the language. Both the most popular, like Icelandic non-binary pronoun, which is haun, that wasn't well known, and when I googled this stuff, there were like maybe 2 or 3 non-binary people that came up, and those articles were usually quite old. So there wasn't a lot to go on. So I struggled with it for quite a bit, but during the same time I was kind of coming out because I had never been good at keeping stuff in, I guess. So, so shortly after I made this realization, I was talking about it with people closer to me, like family and friends. And then it kind of escalated to being quite public. A few years after that, I started dabbling in activism, and through that, I guess it became very public because I have become kind of a, I guess, spokesperson for non-binary rights in Iceland. Of course, not the only one, but one of the prominent ones. So I've done quite a lot of news and media at this point.
So what's it like being non-binary in Iceland?
So I'd say that a lot of non-binary people in Iceland categorize their life a bit, because it's very different in which spheres you are, how easy or difficult it is to be out. Like, my social circles are very open and accepting, but it's not the case for everybody. And that's over all generations. I'd say that there's more likelihood of younger people being more open than older people, but still there are people my age and younger that are quite prejudiced, and there are people, of course, older that are quite prejudiced too. But I'd say that at no point is it debated still if non-binary people exist. Probably some people somewhere debated, like in the privacy of their own homes. But in media and in the law, we are recognized, which is great to have the law beside you in these points. It was 5 years ago, in 2009, that we passed the Gender Autonomy Act in the parliament, and that granted us like legal status compared to male and females. So you can, like, in the national registry, you can be marked as non-binary, and that shouldn't, in theory, hinder you in any way in your life. But of course, that's not the way in practice, because once you've marked yourself as non-binary in the national registry, all your documents, of course, reflect that, and then it can be quite a bit more difficult to travel and stuff, because not all airlines and not all countries recognize non-binary people and their gender as a real thing, or like as a valid thing, I guess. So it's very different based on just personal circumstance if people choose to use these legal rights to sign yourself off as your legal gender, because it is internationally quite a degrade in rights. It's not as much of a degrade in your rights nationally, but there are some places that haven't quite caught up to this change of us being legally recognized. So I'd say being non-binary in Iceland is very different between people, both depending on their social circle, as we touched on before, but also depending on their age and field of like work or career.
So we've heard how progressive the country is when it comes to legal recognition. What about gender-affirming care?
All gender-affirming care is under the trans umbrella, and it is open to non-binary people. When it started up, they were just exclusively for binary trans people, just trans men and trans women. It was like a script you had to fall into, and it was like a very, very narrow mold. But nowadays it isn't like that anymore. Just in the last like 5 years, they have kind of broken down these narrow molds, and at this point you don't have to prove yourself to be trans. It is more of a we want to check that you are sane and well, and then you can get the care, but there are quite long waiting lists for that, and you cannot go to any private people to get ahead of the line. You just have to wait your turn. So when I started my like gender-affirming healthcare, which was probably around 2019 or 2020, that was a very great time to start up, because at that point they had been kind of expanding the team and putting more manpower in phase with the growing number of people coming out. So I got my gender-affirming care without much wait.
Iceland is a tiny country with only 380,000 people living there, and because of this, the queer community is small and tight-knit.
There is like a strong queer community, but when I was coming out, I felt it was a bit hard to access. But I think that can be the case often when people are recently have come out, because then you feel all this emotional pressure and you're kind of coming into a community that is strange, and you see yourself reflected in people maybe in ways that you haven't seen before, and therefore there's a lot of new feelings. But we try to be very open. Now I speak from the inside perspective, whereas in the beginning I found it a bit difficult to like start showing up. But when I started doing it, it immediately felt like a second home, kind of. And the connections I've made through the queer community are amazing. I'd say it's very strong, especially on the trans front these days. So I'd say that for those who end up like seeking out queer community, it is very open. But of course that's very localized also, because it's quite a large country geographically, but we have quite a small population. So people are very spread out on the whole. And in this specific part of the country, it's quite nice, and there's a strong queer community. But that's not the case all around the country. There are pockets, of course, that are nice, and there are also pockets that are quite hostile.
When countries in the world are ranked for their friendliness towards LGBTQIA+ people, Iceland is always in or near the top. People even describe Iceland as a queer utopia. In a sense, we are a queer utopia because we have the most rights here than I think in most other places in the world as of today, both regarding like gender equality between males and females, and also for queer people. But I think this idea of us being a queer utopia is a blessing and a curse in itself, because often it gives people kind of this idea that okay, we have made it to the top and now we can just stop, which isn't the case, because although we are on the top of the chart of leading like in the pursuit of equal rights, it's not like we have equal rights. It's kind of like we are on top of the class, but the class as a whole is failing miserably. So we are like averaging like a 5 out of 10, but most other countries are averaging like a 2. So it's better, but it isn't. I would not say like from my perspective that it is a utopia. So I think that we as a queer community have to kind of toe this very narrow line of yes, being proud of the fact that we have gotten so far, and still not like putting down the front, because then we will not continue to further our rights. And I think it can also lead to kind of this
feeling of being stuck, or at least I've experienced that a bit, because when we look back just 50 years, when people were starting to kind of come out in Icelandic society, at that point, like if we look just 50 years back, we were not as progressive as we are now. Not nearly. We were quite backwards at that point. The social changes have been happening very fast for the last few decades here. So at that point, when queer people came out in Iceland, they were usually just ostracized, and they would move to the mainland, usually to Scandinavia. Copenhagen was like the hub for Icelandic queers to go. And there they would live like quite openly in their tight social circles, and they would just not go back home. Or if they would go home and not tell anybody why they lived abroad. But at this point, we are Copenhagen. Like we are the Copenhagen for the world. Like people come here seeking a better life, and to live here and be so privileged and still feel all these things missing can be a bit depressing. And then you feel quite bad for being depressed and not just grateful. Yeah, because you're like, well, I can't ask for anything better because there isn't anything better. But still I struggle so much at this place.
Let's end the video with Mars's hopes and dreams for the future.
In regards to the queer community here, my hopes and dreams are that we continue with the momentum we have been going with for the last few decades. Because we have made a lot of social changes quite quickly, and we've gone from being quite backwards regarding rights of minority groups to being on the leading front of some of them, mostly regarding gender and queerness, not so much probably regarding racism or immigration or stuff like that. We haven't quite cracked the pot on those things in Icelandic society, but we're doing good on some fronts. So I hope we continue to do that. But I also hope that the general public will be more aware of how things are realistically, so that these changes can be made not just because of these few individual queer people coming together and pushing forward, but because there's a general consensus of humanity and the need for us to be equal as humans. So my ideal future would encompass all of us coming kind of together to fight for these equal rights and change the things that need to be changed. Because of course it is great that the few queer people that have been doing this work have done so, and we have a lot to thank them for, but it is just so all-consuming being part of such big picture activism. And at this point, a lot of queer people don't really have a choice of whether to become an activist or not. Especially queer people that are visibly queer, like non-binary people. You can't really not come out if you want people to recognize you. And therefore you kind of have to become an advocate, which it should be a choice. Like people should be able to just live a quiet life, not in the public sphere, no matter their gender and sexuality and other personal factors. Which probably sounds a bit rich coming from my end of being an activist.
If you enjoyed watching that video, please like, comment, subscribe and share the video. I really appreciate you showing your love in that way. If you also want to support the channel financially, that's possible via Patreon, but really no pressure. See you next time.